Welcome to the EdTech Evidence Group's second webinar in the series. It's great to see so many people turn up tonight at what is an extremely busy time for all. To give some background, so I'm Michael. I'm the founder and CEO of Innovate My School and EdTech Impact. And I'm also co-founder of the EdTech Evidence Group alongside 8 other UK-based EdTech companies. Why did we set up the EdTech Evidence Group? Because we believe collectively that there needs to be a step change in the level of evidence available about EdTech. Our goals are simple: to help improve evidence gathering across the entire EdTech sector, and to support schools and companies in understanding how they can better assess their EdTech solutions. So tonight we've got three interesting guests who bring different perspectives to gathering EdTech evidence. But before I go to them, I want to share some data of my own, really. We can just... So what you see in front of you is data collected through EdTech Impact. So EdTech Impact, very quickly, helps EdTech companies independently collect feedback from their customers around the outcomes they care about. And part of the onboarding process, we ask them, what outcomes does your product care about most? Student outcomes, teacher outcomes, parent outcomes, whole school outcomes. But before they do that, in that same section, we want to get a read of what evidence they're collecting today so we can understand where they're at. And this is what you see. This is over 500 companies. I should say mostly UK. Anyone from startup to scale up to multinational. Some of the biggest players you've all heard of in EdTech have joined. So it's an interesting snapshot. What it tells me is everybody's got a lot of customer quotes and case studies, not so. And as robustness increases, the numbers start to drop. And if we take randomized control trials, for instance, RCTs, often held up as the gold standard for EdTech evidence, only 7% here, assuming they're correct, actually have that, meet that level. You know, if we were selling COVID-19 vaccines here, majority of the people wouldn't make it outside the lab. But in education, you can walk through the door and sell your product to schools. And we've seen the take-up of EdTech over the last 7 or 8 months since March with the pandemic, where schools are turning to technology more than ever, and it's helping them continue learning inside and outside of school through remote environments and now hybrid. So technology in schools is important. We know it can have a huge impact, but it's so important we know that it's having the right impact, a positive impact around the outcomes that not just you care about, but the school cares about. It's why they invest in your product. Impact is ROI for schools. And that's why we're here tonight. We want to really create more awareness around the practical things we can do. We're not here to tell you how to spend £1 million on a randomized control trial. We want to create and unearth practical ways that we can work closer with our customers to measure our impact and build better EdTech evidence. So my first guest I'm going to go to is based in schools. Just to add, so we advertised that Lauren Thorpe was going to be here tonight. Unfortunately, Lauren had to jump to an important meeting in the schools. However, her replacement is of equal measure, and it's a man called John Blake. So John, if you'd like to join us, turn your webcam on. Hey, John.
Hello, hello.
Hello.
Lauren. I'll do my best to channel her combination of efficiency and understanding.
Well, just to give you an introduction, so John drives and supports ARC schools. ARC are one of the largest multi-academy trusts in the UK, 38 schools around the country. John drives and supports ARC's stakeholder engagement and thought leadership on policy and political issues related to schools and education, really driving ARC's wider social purpose. John's a qualified teacher and worked in the classroom for decades, including in middle and senior leadership roles, and involved across highly successful multi-academy trusts. He's held the education brief for one of Britain's most influential think tanks, that'll be the Policy Exchange, and has frequently is a frequently published writer on education policy. He's advised a wide variety of schools and educational organisations, as well as the Department for Education and the Number 10 Policy Unit. So John, welcome. When I spoke to you prior to this call, I asked you about your experience with EdTech, and you described yourself as optimistically skeptical. Apart from being a great album title, could you tell me more why you said that? What's been your experience with EdTech, and give me some examples?
Yeah, so I was a teacher for 10 years as a classroom teacher and head of department and head of faculty, and I think. And I'm also enormously keen on technology in my own life. I'd like to get the latest gadgets and things like that. So I've always wanted to see tech used effectively. But my experience as a classroom teacher was not that. It was often that technology was sort of purchased in haste without necessarily identifying its, how effective it would be in the classroom, or even where it was effective, how much it would tie in with teachers' actual practice. And so, to give an example, I've been involved in projects to put class sets of tablets in the hands of students, and in one case there was for various technical insurance reasons, the tablets couldn't be stored in the classroom, and it meant they were almost never used. It's because once it was too inconvenient to go out and get them. Once it changed the rhythm of the lesson, teachers actually didn't really find that very useful or effective. And I think it's sort of too often I've seen technology offered as the kind of here's this thing that it does, it's really great, how could you incorporate this in classrooms, rather than starting from these are the problems we have in class or that we're facing, what do we need to do about that? And I'll an ARC, so Lauren, who I'm stepping in for here, is leading on our digital strategy, and the digital strategy she's leading on is going to put a lot of Chromebooks in the hands of our students, and we're going to try and do that in a way that blends into things. Sorry, just give me a moment. My daughter needs her bag. Your bag is in the front room. It's in the hallway, Kathleen. Go on. Yes, thank you, Kathleen. The perils of home working. So we've got. And we're keen to do that, but with an acknowledgement that actually that's got to work for what teachers need. And by and large, what we think they need is up-to-date assessment that can be conducted much more effectively and much faster than lots of the assessment currently in use. So we have a huge range of data that we collect in ARC around our young people, but it is really quite labor intensive to do that. It's labor intensive to set the tests, it's labor intensive to mark them, it's labor intensive to make them comparable and compare them across the schools. We are very much committed to doing that. What we need, I think, are assessment tools that make that much more straightforward, that can harvest that data without the need for multiple inputs. But the problem we've often had is lots of the assessment stuff is designed on very generic assessment bases, and the problem with that is that we've got gaps in curriculum stuff, so we need to work out how to do that. The way of identifying that is really quite problematic, because we need it to integrate actively with our curriculum, and it doesn't necessarily do that. I also think, just as a sort of thing, in terms of that, what we're looking for is an improvement in teacher insight, so that teachers know more about their young people than they can currently find out. But that's got to reduce teacher workload effectively, because it can't be something that requires a great deal of additional work to learn or understand, because the problem with that is that teachers just don't have the time and capacity to develop those additional skills, and they will generally stick with what they know. They are quite, and this is a massive generalization, they're quite change averse now, partly because the education profession's had so many years of sort of changes coming down, some of them tech driven, some of them not, that they've experienced and that have not made the difference or not really worked in their classroom. And so without that, they tend, if it's not something they can use instantly and see immediately how it changes their life for the better, makes it easier, increases their insight, that tends to be really problematic for them.
And you mentioned the digital strategy. Digging through the school. You've also mentioned data, understanding what systems you want to get in tech. And I think it's certainly what we've seen more of in schools transition to use tech since March, of creating those foundations around the strategy and then where the tech fits, as opposed to ed before tech rather than tech before ed. Could you tell me a bit more about that in ARC? Because I know ARC really pioneers the use of data and has robust systems in place. What is ARC's relationship with data when it comes to ed tech, and how does that translate to the data you take from companies as well, from the ed tech products you use?
So we have, as I say, a huge amount of data that we collect on our young people, slightly less on our staff, things like that, but we have a data warehouse in which all of that material is stored. We can do lots of comparisons across time, and Lauren and her team are remarkably sophisticated in developing insight from that. And we've recently developed some really effective regular reports that put that data in the hands of our principals sort of automatically and very straightforwardly. Where we need more of that, and I think where we're hoping that as we put digital devices in the hands of our young people, we'll be able to upgrade the quality of that data and the regularity of it. We've got to be a bit careful, because in schools, data and assessment is often seen as purely an accountability tool. Lots of teachers think, the reason you're doing this, you want to know what, you want to know what I've done. And to a certain extent, of course, accountability is a feature of the system, and we need to do that. But actually, what we're interested in is what the young people know and they don't know. So the job that I did for ARC before I became head of public affairs was as curriculum research and design lead, and we made a really knowledge-rich curriculum an absolutely essential part of what we were doing. And we need assessment data that really identifies which bits of that curriculum young people have grasped and which bits they haven't. There are mechanisms to do that through, say, multiple choice testing. But at the moment, we aren't able to necessarily do that across the board in the way that we want. And we're still having to do it at kind of milestone moments at particular points of the year. And actually, what we want to do is have a regular flow of that data that we can then consume and push back out again. And I think particularly as a network, we're conscious that what we can do is provide not just sort of gaps, this child doesn't know what we would expect any 11-year-old to know at this point, but actually also say, look, compared to the rest of their cohort in the school, in the network more generally, and ideally, if we were able to access data sets that went beyond our own network, then, against kids more generally, what I think EdTech or technology can drive is that much greater, much more granular data about what young people are capable of doing, are doing now, need to learn, and that is sort of almost real-time comparable, and that teachers can use it. I mean, that is quite a change to the kind of marking regimes that certainly I was used to when I was a teacher, where you'd have a half-termly assessment. Once you'd marked the assessment, I was a history teacher, so we didn't have lots of lessons in the same week. You marked the assessment, you moved on. You never did anything. You never went back to them and sat down and said, look, this is how you can make it better. So things that allow staff to do that, and I mean that's only, I'm aware that there's a vast range of technology, but I'm just sort of focusing on that example because it feels to me that's an area where teachers will be able to see if it works really quite quickly, how it works, and it will be able to, the mere presence of better data about what is known and not known will allow teachers to adjust their own practice without having to feel like something is being done to them. If you hand them something that says, look, in all honesty, you taught lesson X, but the kids didn't take from it what you expected them to take from it. What will you now do with that? That doesn't have to be a sort of accountability, we're coming down to tell you don't know how to do it metric. That is actually something about saying, look, this isn't as effective as we wanted it to be. I mean, our ARC has one of our, we have ARC curriculum programs which provide curriculum time and resources and assessments to people. And sometimes the assessments don't do what you want them to do, or sometimes the curriculum hasn't done what you wanted to do. The kids don't know it. That's the point about trying to build around that a technological solution that allows you to say, look, we know the teachers did what we expected them to do. We know the teachers taught this material. The fact the kids don't know it suggests that something's gone wrong. Now, that may be the teacher, but actually in many cases, that's the least likely reason for it. It's either that we've pitched it wrong, or we've resourced it incorrectly, or we've not given enough time for it, or we're not assessing it correctly. And we want to have, I think, a technological solution that allows us to reorient it so that it's not always you, the teacher, has not done what you were supposed to do, when often that's not the case, or worse, it may be the case, but it's because it was never very clear what you were supposed to be doing in the first place.
So yeah, and if ARC, so you mentioned this is the aspiration. Is this an opportunity then, would you say, for edtech companies?
Yeah, I think the pandemic has created a massive opportunity because it has opened people's eyes to both the necessity of this and it's massively expanded the number of people who are paying attention to work out how it works. So I think one of the weaknesses with EdTech in the time that I was in the classroom was that the people that it was sold to often weren't the people who would necessarily use it directly. I remember we had one school I worked in had a school information management system that could not generate behavior instances department by department. It could do it by year group, and it could do it overall, and it could do it by tutor group, which was very convenient for the pastoral deputy head who had been one of the people who'd commissioned it into the school. It wasn't very useful for me as a head of department in a school where I was supposed to be running departmental detentions for kids who'd got behavior instances in my department. And that's, again, a very small example, but it's those sort of, when you aggregate all of those things together, you often, and what ends up happening is teachers find their own workarounds. And then you think, well, what was the point in the first place? We're now not using that. So I think but now you have a far greater range of people who are directly involved. And I think there is a real opportunity to go and say, look, what is it that would make a difference? Would this make a difference? But I think there is a level of humility that, and I'm not for a moment, I've encountered, particularly when I was at Policy Exchange doing lots of work on curriculum resources, I know that it's not sort of an arrogant sector, but I think to teachers, often external provision comes across as not understanding their position, not really appreciating their workload, and not really contributing to making it better. So I think it's a sort of humility and approach to a wider end teachers that says, look, this is, what problems do you have? Would this help? And it's about ongoing partnership. Because I think one of the things that we're conscious of with our digital strategy is that we're at the edges of the evidence. We know that there is some evidence that digital instruments make a big difference. There's plenty that they can be a total waste of time. We don't want that, but we think what we're doing is, we think it's going to be effective, but we also know that it's at the edge of no one's tried to do what we're trying to do in the way we're trying to do it before. So we're going to have to make changes. Some things will work, some things won't. And as long as we're not making the same mistakes that others have already made, I think if we're making all new mistakes, that's fine. But we need to bring our teachers along and our principals along with us in that journey. We need them to understand that not everything will work first time around. And that's part of the point, that we want their feedback. We don't want them to mask something that doesn't work because that's not useful. We need to know what isn't working. And again, that's a change in emphasis and experience that I think the system has got more used to and hopefully will do. But it does feel, I think, quite different than the sort of the very high accountability metrics of the past, in which if something wasn't working, the best thing to do was basically just sort of soldier on and not tell anyone, because otherwise you got blamed for it. I think partnership is a really big key, and long-term partnership, that the sort of sense of the days in which people will just come in, sell you some tech and then leave are and should be long gone.
I absolutely agree. There's a term that gets bandied around where companies often get called snake oil. And yeah, I think you're only in EdTech if you're in it for the long term. You get found out pretty quickly. There's not many founders that are super rich. And I think the backgrounds they've come from, that they created a product to solve a pain point, to improve outcomes for.
And I think part of the problem comes from the experience when there was a lot of money in the 2000s, where we ended up with things like whiteboards and interactive whiteboards, things like technology that could be, I've sold you this and now I'm going to leave. But actually, interactive whiteboards, they're not. You can use them. Are they the thing I would have chosen to spend that much money on at that time with what we now know? Possibly not. And I think it's getting past that ingrained experience of teachers that they've had in the past, which has been people have turned up and said, here's a magic box, it will solve all your problems, and actually saying that that we are in partnership with you, we will be there to support you, but you also need to be in partnership with us. You need to be honest with us about what works and what doesn't work. You need to be clear what solutions you want, and you need to provide that feedback. And I think that's got to flow both ways. But my sense is that in the pandemic response, schools are looking for things that will help them, but they are also short of time and capacity. and resource. So the first move in that is often going to have to be made proactively by people who think they've got something that can help them, and they're going to need to be sensitive to how they pitch that to schools that feel quite fragile. Yeah,
it's certainly high stakes, and we've got to get it right. I want to take a step back from the sort of provider-school relationship and insert a new stakeholder, and this is parents. Something we've really seen increase since the pandemic again. Where do you think parents fit into the equation now in this relationship, and how can we collect data from them, or how do they fit into the EdTech evidence?
So I think the parental relationship in general, I mean, in some ways, this is, lots of what I'm saying, I think, doesn't just apply to EdTech. It applies to lots of things that go in education. I think it's true of the parent piece. Parents have always been a crucial relationship for schools, but I think it has been brought home to us absolutely how essential that relationship is, because we know that parents who are actively engaged in the home learning that we were doing in the pandemic, those young people have benefited from that. Now, again, I'm not blaming parents who couldn't do that, either because of time or resource. It's not a galloping shock they couldn't, but we need to work out how to correct that. And I do feel that parents are often and have been forgotten. I think, just to give one example, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who her child is the bubbles burst, so the kids are at home for a couple of weeks, and she's been sent materials and resources to work through, but they've got no answer sheets. So if she doesn't know the answer to the question the kid has been asked, she can't do anything with it. And again, very small example, but it's that kind of helping the relationship, making sure that parents feel that they've got someone to go and be supported and access that. And again, technology, I think, can have a really big role in that. I mean, when we did, so at the beginning of the pandemic, we did a fairly comprehensive survey of our parents. Bear in mind, ARC operates mostly in London, but also in Birmingham, Portsmouth and Hastings. So we got quite an interesting feedback. And we concluded that digital access was not as, so there was a big sort of, so many kids don't have any access to digital materials. That wasn't what we found. There is a portion of our cohort who didn't have any access to that, but actually, and bear in mind that ARC works in deprived circumstances, it was much smaller, I think, than we'd expected. The problem wasn't digital access. The problem was multi-device access. There was often only one device in the house that could be used, or if there were multiple devices, they were generally smartphones. So things that for which most, and again, I may be speaking from an experience that is old now, but my sense is that most things are not optimized to work in those formats. So a lot of the stuff, I mean, I'm on also, one of the things I do is I'm on the Oak project board, and I know that that was one of the things that we had to focus on in Oak pretty quickly, was that it needed to be accessible through smartphones and things like that. And I think it's that sense of device agnosticism and screen size being different and things like that, and that it needs to, and parents will need to be able to do that. They need to feel able to do that. And of course, in our communities, that also means a lot of language translation. We have a number of parents who don't speak English, and they have to be engaged. And again, it feels to me like technology can help with all of these problems. They're things, everything I've said, I think, is something that in some sphere or another, technology is working to support. It just, I mean, I often think about EdTech, that it's funny we call it EdTech, because the EdTech that works, we don't call EdTech. Nobody calls their computer EdTech. It's just their computer that they use in the classroom, and it's getting past the idea of EdTech into just tech. This is what does the job you need it to do. I'm encouraged by a lot of what I've seen over the course of the pandemic, and I think there is a positive moment here. But as I say, I think schools are not at the moment optimally set up to necessarily feed back to the sector precisely what they need and precisely how they need it. So it's going to take a lot of work on the supplier side to get that information.
John, we're going to have to wrap up.
Sorry, I've rambled on for too long, but I hope that's been useful.
I was reluctant to interrupt you. I wanted you to keep going. Quick one before you go. If there's one data that EdTech companies could give you that would make you really happy, what would that be?
I mean, the thing I most want is essentially real-time assessment data. If we could have things where we were getting a sort of little bits and pieces of assessment about curriculum understanding. Lauren would probably give you a much bigger answer, but as a curriculum person, what have they actually learned this lesson? Let's get really accurate, really speedy, really workload reducing data about that, and it would make a huge difference to the way that teachers plan and deliver their lessons, but without them feeling it was an imposition.
Thanks so much, John. Really appreciate you taking the time there.
All right, thanks very much.
Okay, so next we're going to move on to Dr. Kristen Weatherby. So for those of you who haven't met Kristen, Kristen is an independent researcher and consultant helping EdTech companies understand, measure, and communicate their impact in education. Most recently, she helped develop and launch University College London's Educate Accelerator program, supports EdTech startups develop world-class products. She also spent time at the OECD. Kristen led the 2013 Panelist survey, working with governments and partners to survey 104,000 teachers about their working conditions and learning environments. At Microsoft, Kristen led initiatives to support schools and teachers integrating tech into teaching in the United States, United Kingdom, and worldwide. And her research examines technology use in teacher professional development, as well as broader issues impacting the status of the teaching profession globally. Kristen holds a PhD in EdTech from the UCL Institute of Education, a master's in teaching from the University of Michigan, and is a governor of her local primary school. Welcome, Kristen.
Thanks, Michael.
So I've known Kristen for quite some time. We've talked a lot about this conversation around this topic of how we can help education EdTech companies collect school level data from their customers, and also how we can help schools, how we can upskill them on collecting better EdTech evidence to measure their impact. Before we sort of dig into that, what exciting projects have you been working on lately?
I'm actually, believe it or not, working on some COVID-related projects. So I've been lucky enough to work with a couple different organizations that are kind of studying what's been happening around the world with distance learning and trying to figure out how to create a more equitable offering for all schools and teachers. So I worked with a foundation in Spain that supports some of the most disadvantaged schools in the most challenging areas. So basically schools that have lots of refugee children or immigrant children or are really in really deprived areas. And they're trying to, those kids just weren't getting the same quality of education as other Spanish children during the lockdown. So they're trying to support these schools in some sort of digital online education that they can use at a distance. And so I helped them do some research to understand what those schools need. And it was really, really interesting. I'm still doing some work with the OECD, which I love. And I'm doing some research again with another group of countries trying to understand how to do distance learning better. And that's for the Gulf States region. So I'm learning a lot right now about what works in distance learning and what happened in that region in particular during the lockdown. So that's also fascinating. And then I'm working with a startup at the moment that I've been working with all year, a startup in France that centers their entire work around evidence. Even their name, even the name of this company has the word evidence in it. And so they wanted to work with me on a particular suite of products that they have to help develop one particular feature of those products that's centered around teachers. And so I've been with them every step of the way, basically, from kind of just looking at academic research about what works and what doesn't work in this particular feature of this kind of product. And then what we're doing now is a co-design process, which I love. And we're working with teachers to actually design this feature with teachers, because the idea is that if teachers are involved in designing this particular feature, they're more likely to use it and find it useful and more likely to use the product. So it's really fun.
Sounds, yeah, it does. Let's just hang on that. So co-design, that's come up a lot. I'm seeing a lot coming out of Finland lately around creating ways that getting into the classroom and working right alongside the schools. And I know some companies in the UK do this really well, and the results are that they have a better product. Tell me about your experience of how, not so much how to get through the doors of a school, that's a whole different conversation, has its own challenges, but when working with your existing customers, what can you do to measure impact?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think that John said just now that was so good was that companies really need to think about schools more as partners, and you can't just run in and sell and go anymore. And I absolutely agree with that. And what's interesting too is that all of this work that this French company did with schools with me sitting here in my house in Oxfordshire was all during lockdown. And so we were able to find schools who were interested in working with us, first of all, which was fantastic. And that is, as you say, like a separate kettle of fish. And it's very challenging because schools are even busier now than they ever have been. And teachers are even more exhausted now than they ever have been. But we were able to do things like have focus groups with teachers, and give them surveys and get feedback from them and give them this product to try out with their students and still get feedback. And so basically the co-design process is kind of all about, developing a prototype for a product with teachers, then developing that product, then piloting it, and doing several cycles of kind of piloting, feedback, development, piloting, feedback, development. And so it's just, it's a great way to get teachers involved every step of the process, but you don't have to be so in depth. As I said, teachers just don't have time at the moment. One of the things that I did a short video during lockdown for the Chartered College to talk about how teachers can, teachers here are using all this new technology that they've never used before. And that's fantastic and very exciting, but how do they even know that it's working? And how are they going to decide ultimately whether they want to purchase this tech or not? So one of the things that I said in this little video is, everybody has, even the busiest people have 5 to 10 minutes a day. And teachers often ask their learners, their students, to keep a journal to reflect on their own learning, their own progress, and to kind of help them, regulate their own learning and motivate themselves. And teachers can do the same with new tech. And this becomes a source of evidence. So if a teacher sits down at the end of every day with their journal and, you as a company can provide them with prompts of questions that you want answers to, then the teacher can just write down at the end of every day, okay, this worked, this didn't work. These are the students that this worked for. These are the students that this didn't work for. This is what I would do differently next time. I mean, that takes no time at all. And then at the end of a month of that, you have so much interesting evidence that not only helps the teacher understand, okay, did this work for me? Did this work for my learners? But also understand, what pedagogies he or she used that they would use again with this particular piece of tech, which students need a little bit more support. And the company has all sorts of information as well.
So simple. So 10 minutes a day. Any teacher can do this. Give them the nudge, you're the EdTech company, and then you're just building continual body of evidence that you can act on immediately right now in a lockdown scenario.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that I would say that a lot of companies, because I used to work on UCL Educate, and I worked really closely with a lot of startups and have since then as well. But one of the startups that I worked with on UCL Educate was a company called Littlebridge. And one of the things that I think companies forget is how much data they already have that they're able to, they have to check if they're able to use it, first of all, and what their kind of T's and C's are already with schools. But Littlebridge had been around for a while, and I can tell you this because I'm just publishing an academic article on it, so it'll be shortly out in public in a few months with the co-founder of Littlebridge. But they actually looked at video testimonials they had. So they had spent 3 years, and you wouldn't think necessarily that a video marketing testimonial is valid data, but there's lots of different kinds of valid data and lots of different kinds of valid evidence. And you want a mixture of evidence as well, so you can tell a more complete story. So Littlebridge had traveled around to the 12 or so countries that they had worked in over a period of 3 years to collect essentially marketing testimonials. And as they were interviewing people, parents and teachers in schools, and asking the questions they wanted to ask, they actually got, hours and hours of video footage talking about a lot of different things. And so they had developed some of their own hypotheses about their product and how it worked well. And they went back through that video testimonial data and looked specifically to see if they could find answers to some of their research questions that would address these hypotheses they had. And they did. So they ended up being able to go through what they thought was just marketing data in a systematic research way, and then They had all sorts of platform data. So they were able to do a quantitative analysis of usage data from their platform, which then answered some other really interesting questions. So you have to think also about, what do you already have that's available to you that you may not have asked questions of already?
That's amazing. And, I'm noticing the same, that people have got a lot to say right now. When a supplier comes to take and we say, we're going to help you collect reviews from your customers, they think, well, I can't ask them for, they're already workload's really high, they've got a lot on their plate. Actually, they're very happy to share what they think about your product, especially when it's around the impact it's having, and they know it's going to help you improve and make a better product as a result. We had a record number of teachers want to write for Innovate My School over the summer. We couldn't believe it on the back of the term they just had. Yeah. The inbox was full. We couldn't believe it. Just put one call out. People have got a lot to say, and I think little things like video testimonials, so easy. Like, make it as easy as possible for them. Don't try and hide the ask in a newsletter. Be really direct and just make it simple for them to share this feedback. That's great.
Yeah.
So what other practical steps do you think? So what's the difference between I suppose some of the evidence collection that was going on prior to remote learning and now in this world that we're in? What practical things can companies do to prove that their product is working?
I mean, one of the tricky part, you can't do some really in-depth observations. You can't go into the classroom in a lot of cases and sit and watch people use your product, which is a really, really helpful method of data collection. You just can't do it, unfortunately. But honestly, the Spanish Foundation that I worked with, for example, they did all of their data collection at a distance, and they did surveys first, and then of all of the schools that they worked with, and that was 92 schools. And then they followed it up with interviews of a subset of the schools. And they ended up with a trove of data, basically. So one of the things that I was trying to help them with is how to make sure that they had really clear research questions first, which is always how I start with everybody, so that when they kind of were trying to get through all this data, they didn't get lost in the huge amount of data they had, and they were able to just focus on the questions they wanted to answer. But I think what I would suggest to companies first is this idea of, it doesn't have to be a research question. Don't get scared off by that term. But
next,
yeah, you need to think about what is it? It's the question you want to answer. What do you want to know about your product? And try to make each question about one thing instead of each question about 10 things. But really try to think about what you want to know, and think about why you want to know it. So is it to help with research and development, and you're just going to use the answer to that question to help you build a better product or prototype? Is it to communicate with key stakeholders, like people who invested in you? Is it for marketing purposes? Is it to help create materials that will help your users use your product? So information on how your product is being used and when it's successful and when it's not. So those are all valid reasons. The other thing I would advise companies is, what happens if you do all this research and you don't get the answer that you want? So what happens if, every company I've ever worked with thinks that when they do this research, they are going to get, they're just going to prove that their product really works and it's fantastic, and they're going to get a positive result. But there's a chance that you won't, or there's a chance that the data you get back will not give you kind of enough of a conclusion that's positive or negative. So you have to think about what happens if you don't get the answer that you want, and how are you going to learn from that. But there's lots, really, we did virtual focus groups with the French company, which was great, with French teachers. And I think, honestly, in some regards, it was easier to get teachers time when they just had to switch on for 2 hours at the end of the day, rather than travel somewhere, because we had teachers from all over France. That was the other thing, is we were able to work with a wider range of teachers than just the kind of teachers from the school down the road, after school for an hour when everybody's tired. These teachers were in their homes. One of them was even smoking a cigarette, so they were relaxed, and we got a lot of really interesting data. And then they were so excited about the product that they were really willing to continue and answer surveys and continue to be involved in our research. So that was fun.
That's brilliant. Yeah, it just feels like it's about continuous feedback loop between you and your customers. And just on the bit about what if the results aren't good, it's just like getting a bad review. You actually have the opportunity now to impress that customer with how good you deal with that feedback. Yeah. Show two sides of the story, show your quality by dealing with that and improving and listening to them and making those changes. That would be my view.
Absolutely, and I think you need to think about as a company as well, something that you said, Michael, in your intro about, lots of companies put their products on the market without having gathered this kind of evidence. And I mean, you and I saw it when I was working at UCL and helping you with EdTech Impact, and we were trying to ask suppliers, what does your product do? What outcomes does it generate? And how long do users have to use the product, and for what frequency and duration to get those outcomes? And companies couldn't answer. No. So the thing is, for me, obviously in medicine, there's really strict regulations on what medicines can be approved, for example, because we don't want to kill people. But there's an issue of ethics in education as well. Children get one chance at their education. And do you really want to put a product in the market that may not work, that you don't know if it works? And to me, it's an ethical issue. So I think it's just important. It's all of our responsibility to make sure that companies who are working in education know that their product works.
On that note, I think we're going to leave it there, Kristen. We could talk all day. We'll do a spin-off webinar just with yourself and John. Thanks so much for that time.
Thanks, Michael.
Feel free to put your details in the chat as well. So our last guest is from the perspective of an EdTech company. So we have Dr. Junaid Mubeen. Hi, Junaid.
Hello.
So to give background, Junaid is a research mathematician turned educator, working in the nexus of education, innovation, and technology. Director of Education at Whizz Education. Junaid oversees the EdTech strategy and development of the Whizz virtual tutoring service, which has reached over 500,000 students worldwide. Junaid has a PhD in mathematics from Oxford and a master's in international education policy from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. He writes and speaks in a range of EdTech topics. Whizz Education have been around for a long time. I've 15 years?
15 years.
You don't achieve that without doing something right. And so, yeah, and what I'm intrigued most about is your title of Director of Education, because having worked with a lot of startups, you don't often get the luxury of having that role. Tell me about a day in the life of Junaid Mubeen. What does that look like?
Well, I'll spare you the blow-by-blow account, but I can tell you that I've been at Whizz for around 6 or 7 years, and about halfway into that journey, so I think it was the summer of 2017, I was tasked by our CEO, Richard Marriott, to set up an education department, and it was literally a blank canvas. Richard's thinking was very simple and quite powerful. He thought, on the one hand, we have all this commercial data, we look at our revenue numbers, and then we use that to drive key behaviors to improve the performance of the business, as any company should do. But we're also an education partner accountable to learning outcomes. We have a whole treasure trove of learning data that's streaming out of our virtual tutoring platform. So doesn't it make sense to engage in a very deliberate way with our learning data and also use that to drive key educational behaviors? That was basically the remit that I was given to set up an education department. And so on any given day, I'm looking at our learning data and really trying to capture something of the context and story that's beneath it, and try to then understand how we can better support our clients. So I interact very closely with pretty much all the departments at Whizz. So I work very closely with the implementation team. And we're an international company, so we have a diverse portfolio of projects around the world. And so we're constantly trying to grab insights and perspectives from what's happening on the ground, and then have mechanisms and frameworks in place to recycle those data insights into meaningful action. So developing tools, frameworks, resources to make sure that our colleagues on the ground, and in turn our clients, are actually supported in real time to drive learning outcomes. I actually headed up the product team before I took on the education remit, and so we still work very closely with them, making sure that they're not just designing compelling user experiences, but also learner experiences, to make sure that, you know, for every feature that's developed, there's some forethought and consideration given to the underlying pedagogical assumptions. And then finally, I work closely with our marketing team, making sure that we're actually packaging those insights, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, and disseminating that through a range of channels. We have a number of external research partners, but we're constantly looking at the evidence and trying to take the best of what's out there. But we found over time that whether you're a mathematician, economist, a learning scientist, our data just gives rise to a number of interesting research questions. So it's been interesting to manage a whole range of research partnerships. I will say that the greatest privilege of my role is actually going out onto the front lines and seeing how MathsWhiz and our various services play out in practice. I've had limited opportunities to do that of late, but you know, I could be in Kenya one week and Mexico the next, and it's just a phenomenal exercise to have some of your assumptions and aspirations kind of confronted with hard realities.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Can you tell me more about that then? So when you go out to the front line, what are you doing there? Because this has been a theme throughout the whole tonight.
So when we started to take a closer look, so we've always had this real-time learning data, and we've always had these reporting dashboards, but it was only really a few years ago where we started to then operationalize that as part of our sort of day-to-day modus operandi. And so one of the things we would look at is just a very natural, intuitive thing to do, is to try to identify the highest performing schools. And I can tell you that our assumptions were completely defeated. So we found that over the period we were looking at the time, the top performing school was in rural Kenya. The second highest performing school was in rural Mexico. And these are resource constrained environments, rural communities. The context for those projects is, or the funding, comes from international development initiatives, where the idea is to try to bring these students, particularly girls, from the fringes of society and get them back into education. I'll just share a brief anecdote of what I learned in Mexico, which was not very much, because I was able to visit a whole number of schools, but this particular one that I was keen to see, I wasn't able to visit because apparently, like the day before we were due to visit, the local police had actually lost control of the village, and it kind of fallen into the hands of local militia, and so they had to close the schools. And so it was just, it was it was obviously disheartening to go all the way to Mexico and not be able to visit the school, but it was kind of mind-blowing to be confronted with that, thinking that if that's the challenge that I'm facing, visiting from my ivory tower here in the UK, what must it be like for the parents and teachers and students? One of the things we did learn is that despite the fact that they were enjoying the highest levels of usage and highest levels of progress on our tutoring platform, the school actually owned 2 laptops for 500 students. The rest were donated by local businesses, and the parents were actually going to local pawn shops and basically trading in jewelry and whatever other limited goods they had to try to get the infrastructure up to scratch. So one of the things we've learned over and over again is the importance of having a holistic and integrated approach. It's all well and good if you've got the software, but if you don't have devices, connectivity, if you don't have ways of supporting and training teachers and really building capacity from the ground up, you're not going to get very far.
Well, really, similarities could be drawn with the UK as well.
Indeed, yeah. So I think we're all facing something along those lines now with COVID. I won't go as far as to say that. I can tell you that in Kenya, we've had similar instances. We've had Ebola in some of our contexts in other parts of Africa, and we've had schools shut down almost immediately. We've had dams bursting and preventing students from accessing schools. So we have had to, remote learning and contingency planning is just part of their bread and butter, which is not to say we've nailed it down completely, but there's just a certain resourcefulness that those communities espouse. And we are starting to see more of that now in the UK, I think, as we're all sort of getting to grips with our new normal.
Could you tell me, because you mentioned about collecting data through the platform, through Whizz itself. I thought, obviously, there's things that can be collected from the schools, but how is evidence collection built in to Whizz itself, and how are you using that to measure your impact?
Yeah, so I feel there's a couple of questions there. So in terms of the data that we collect, I mean, I took real interest in what John was saying earlier about the need for real-time assessment data, because that's basically what you get through MathsWhiz. Students are interacting with this virtual tutoring platform, and on a lesson-by-lesson, question-by-question basis, our system is collecting and aggregating learning insights, which we then make available to students, parents, teachers, researchers. So our data collection is a natural byproduct of students' learning interactions. Now, in terms of how we understand impact, we have a theory of change. It's something we've refined over several years. We actually participated in Educate, so that was a good experience for us. And our theory of change is really rooted in this belief that if you have data speaking to you in real time and you engage with it in a very proactive way, then you don't need to wait until the end of an implementation to have a sense of whether it's working or not. And in fact, you can move away from those sort of binary questions of whether the thing is working. If you're engaged with data on a day-to-day basis, you can actually take course corrective action in the moment. So our product team, for example, are very keen advocates of this concept of learning engineering. This idea that our platform is really a test bed for trialing lots of different ideas, features, learning interventions, using the tools of A/B testing, which is really just a euphemism for randomized control trials. And so there's this opportunity to have evidence-based feature design baked in to the way in which you develop your products and services. Now, to the specific question of measuring impact, it always for us starts with the client. We always make a point of nailing down their definition of success. And invariably, it involves assessment outcomes, test scores, but it can also involve other things, reducing teacher workload, increasing student attitudes, and other things that are tied to our value proposition. And then in terms of how to conduct an impact study, we didn't feel we had to reinvent the wheel there. There are lots of good frameworks out there. I think you referenced the standards for evidence by Nesta, and that's perfectly a perfectly good benchmarking tool for us. I do want to make a point. I think Kristen made this point too, that we really need to take a pluralistic attitude to evidence. We really need to pluralize the term, because it's great if you can run a large-scale RCT. We've done that in places like Kenya. They do come replete with their own issues, ethical issues, logistical issues, and so we have other efficacy studies of varying different flavors. They can be small scale. They may or may not involve control groups, and I think that's okay to have a range of evidences as long as the strength of your claim is proportional to the rigor of those studies. And I think as long as you're transparent about that, that will help to engender confidence and buy-in. And really, it's about benchmarking all the data, all the insights that you're gathering through your products and services, benchmarking that against external criteria that ultimately matters to clients.
How do you share your evidence with your clients in a way that builds a more positive relationship? You're doing a lot of data collection. I can see that. And you're doing a lot with the data.
Yes. So we actually have it built into our service offerings. We have a whole kind of menu of services. And so part of that is, you can just get the product and run with it. You'll still get a level of training and support. But what we've tried to impress upon clients, and this is an insight we really picked up from the international development sector, and now it's permeated its way over to many of our relationships here in the UK and over in the US, where from the moment we sign a contract, we will develop an implementation plan, and as part of that, as I said, nail down their definition of success, and then start to put in place a plan to actually measure impact in the long term. And so there are two dynamics in play. There's the data that's speaking to us on a day-to-day basis and ensuring that we have the mechanisms to recycle that into meaningful actions. And then secondly, there's the kind of more summative evaluation that comes from an impact study. And so we will design all of that up front. And as I said, you're not always going to have the luxury of doing an RCT. And it turns out not every client feels the need to kind of engage with sort of that level of machinery. And so as long as we have a clear design up front, our clients tend to then have that assurance that whether or not you then end up with the outcomes that you desire. So to Kristen's point, you may not get a statistically significant effect size at the end, but we found that's okay as long as you have an action plan. As long as, I mean, firstly, that in the interest of adopting a scientific approach, you have to be open to all conclusions. And I think we feel our accountability isn't just to hopefully getting positive outcomes, but also having a clear rationale as to why outcomes weren't achieved in particular contexts, and to having contingencies in place to understand how we can then build on the data that we're seeing, even if it isn't overwhelmingly positive. It really is about having a continuous feedback loop and making sure that you're able to take course corrective action throughout the life cycle of an implementation, so that you're not just relying on a post-mortem at the end.
I was really looking forward to this talk, looking under the bonnet at Whizz to see what you're doing. It's fascinating. What can a plucky startup do? Because they're a very different beast to where you're at as a company in size and resources. What would what practical advice would you give them today as a next step? And clearly work out your theory of change, work on that. Clearly that's the first step, but beyond that, what would you suggest?
I'd say a couple of things. I'd say you can be very resourceful by sourcing educational expertise outside of your organization. So, we now have this small education department within Whizz, but we're working with a number of research partners externally. And as I mentioned, we were part of Educate, and those opportunities are just a brilliant way of kind of extending your expertise, even beyond your own salaries. I will say though that it's very easy. The easiest thing in EdTech is to say that you're following an evidence-informed approach. It's much like politicians saying they're following the science. Like, why wouldn't you say such a thing? It's a slightly more difficult though to bring specificity to that. So that I think is the real virtue of a theory of change. It really holds you to specifying in very concrete terms what you mean by evidence, and don't be monolithic about it. Allow RCTs to be part of the mix, but there are many different ways of conceiving and measuring evidence. So adopt a pluralistic attitude. And make sure that in whatever way you source educational expertise, whether it's in-house or externally, don't allow it to just sit on the fringes. Don't make it a tokenistic effort, because you just won't get your return on investment. Make sure that they are working hand in hand with every department in your organization, and that they're infusing their perspectives and expertise across the business. And make sure that they combine theory with practice. My best hire at Whizz has been my colleague Fiona, who brought 30 years of classroom teaching experience, which I frankly didn't have. And between the two of us, we're able to kind of capture evidence-informed research, but also make sure that it's grounded in that pragmatic intent.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Junaid. Again, we could easily talk all day. Really appreciate your time. I can't see any questions in the chat, so I'm going to round up here. So the EdTech Evidence Group, this is the second webinar in a series. We will be doing more. We're now at the stage where we're able to open up membership. So the whole vision with this was not to be a group of 9 people, but the entire sector to be able to get involved, share their learnings, and ultimately raise the awareness of evidence collection, building that evidence base holistically. So what I'm asking here is, if you're interested in joining the EdTech Evidence Group, then we're looking to open up to 10 companies to begin with. So please do get in touch via the website. I believe it's been put in the chat, edtechevidence.com. We'd love to hear from you. Let's just continue the discussion. I hope you found it insightful tonight. I really have. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks again. Bye.